Constitution Day, Distrust, Tyranny, and the Bill of Rights. Part 1 of 5 on Understanding the Bill of Rights. Ronald J. Ricklack. Contributor. September 16, 2018. Updated, September 20, 2018. Print. In honor of U.S. Constitution Day, on September 17, we present a 5-part series on the Bill of Rights. It reveals how the first 10 amendments to the Constitution guarantee freedom of speech, religion, and the press, and, in so many other ways, limit the power of the federal government and secure the rights of individuals. Thomas Jefferson said, "When governments fear the people, there is liberty. When people fear the government, there is tyranny." A recent Gallup poll found that 72% of Americans see big government as the most significant threat to the nation. To compare, 21% said big business and only 5% said big labor. That's not a good sign for big government. Of course, the truth is that Americans throughout history have been distrustful of government. After all, this nation sprung out of a revolution that overthrew a king who most Americans saw as tyrannical. The Bill of Rights, one of America's foundational documents, was designed specifically to address this distrust by limiting the power of the federal government and thereby preventing a new tyranny. As such, the Bill of Rights is the single most powerful and successful assertion of individual rights and liberties ever written. It is one of history's most important and influential documents and the world's best roadmap for human rights and freedom from oppression. To understand the Bill of Rights, look back to colonial days. Back then, there was no national American identity. To the extent there was something bigger than the colony, it was England. Of course, a great deal of resentment toward England developed even prior to the Revolutionary War. During the war, it only got worse. Nevertheless, after the colonists overthrew England, it became clear that they needed some type of union to facilitate trade and self-defense. They didn't want to create a new King George, but rather a strong central government that might do the same kind of things that the British had done. Richard Henry Lee, a statesman from Virginia, said, "The first maxim of a man who loves liberty should be, never to grant to rulers an atom of power that is not most clearly and indispensably necessary for the safety and well-being of society." So, in that hot summer in Philadelphia, in 1787, as the founders were hammering out a new constitution with its separation of powers and checks and balances, they also discussed the need for a provision that would limit the authority of this new central government, a Bill of Rights. John Adams refused to support the Constitution unless the Federalists could guarantee that the said Constitution be never construed to authorize Congress to infringe the just liberty of the press, or the rights of conscience, or to prevent the people of the United States from keeping their own arms, or to subject the people to unreasonable searches and seizures of their persons, papers, or possessions. Others argued that if the Constitution contained enumerated rights, it might be construed as excluding those not named. Hamilton, for instance, in Federalist 84, said, "I go further, and affirm that bills of rights, in the sense and to the extent in which they are contended for, are not only unnecessary in the proposed Constitution but would even be dangerous. They would contain various exceptions to powers not granted, and, on this very account, would afford a tolerable pretext to claim more than were granted." So, some people wanted a bill to limit the federal government, while others opposed such a bill not because they wanted a significant federal government, but because they, too, were afraid of a strong central government. The sovereignty of the states was a principle on which both sides of this debate agreed. The Constitution was eventually drafted without a Bill of Rights. At that point, an interesting thing happened. When it was sent to the states for ratification, it rapidly became clear that the Constitution wouldn't be approved without a list of enumerated rights. So, an agreement was reached. The Constitution would be ratified as written, but the first Congress would add a Bill of Rights. James Madison, who had originally opposed having a Bill of Rights, undertook the task of preparing the document, and here, he showed his true genius. First of all, he had to identify the rights that would be included. Over 200 suggestions were sent in from the states, and he had to decide which to keep and which to eliminate. Madison took the suggestions and distilled them to 20 amendments with a separate preamble. Some representatives opposed the proposal, arguing that any move to amend the new Constitution so soon after its implementation would create an appearance of instability in the government, but the House of Representatives ultimately approved a version with 17 amendments. This version went to the Senate, where it underwent more extensive revisions and emerged as a document containing 12 amendments. Congress approved this final Bill of Rights, as a joint resolution on September 25, 1789. The document sent to the colonies for ratification had 12 proposed amendments, but only 10 of those were ratified. Those 10 are now familiar to Americans as the Bill of Rights. Of the 2 that weren't ratified, the first dealt with the size of electoral districts and was never ratified. A version of the second proposed amendment, which prohibits pay raises for Congress members until the next election, eventually was ratified in 1992 as the 27th Amendment. It's amusing when people speak of the special honor given to the First Amendment. After all, it was initially proposed as the third. The brilliance of the Bill of Rights is that it doesn't actually grant rights to U.S. citizens. It assumes that the rights exist, and restricts the government from interfering. In a literal sense, the Bill of Rights isn't a list of rights but a list of restrictions on governmental power, and it stems from the traditional American concern about the dangers of a strong central government. Ronald J. Ricklack is the Jamie L. Whitten Chair in Law and Government at the University of Mississippi. He is the author of several books, including Hitler, the War, and the Pope, Disinformation, co-authored with Ion Mihai Pacepa, and The Persecution and Genocide of Christians in the Middle East, co-edited with Jane Adolph. Views expressed in this article are the opinions of the author and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Epoch Times. How is the Epoch Times different from other media? The Epoch Times is the fastest growing independent media in America. We are different from other media organizations because we are not influenced by any government, corporation, or political party. Our only goal is to bring our readers accurate information and to be responsible to the public. We don't follow the unhealthy trend in today's media environment of agenda-driven journalism and instead use our principles of truth and tradition as our guiding light. Constitution Day, the 9th and 10th Amendments. Part 2 of 5 on Understanding the Bill of Rights. Ronald J. Ricklack. Contributor. September 17, 2018 updated, September 17, 2018. Print. In honor of U.S. Constitution Day, on September 17, we present a 5-part series on the Bill of Rights. It reveals how the first 10 amendments to the Constitution guarantee freedom of speech, religion, and the press, and, in so many other ways, limit the power of the federal government and secure the rights of individuals. The first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution constitute the Bill of Rights. The first 8 of those amendments clearly were designed to protect citizens from the type of governmental intrusions that were common under British rule, but the last 2 are different in nature. The First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The British had done all those things. The Second Amendment protects the right of the people to keep and bear arms. It wasn't about hunting or self-defense. Even before the war, the Brits had begun to confiscate guns. The Third Amendment prevents the military from quartering soldiers during peacetime in any house, without the consent of the owner. During times of war, it could be done only in a manner to be prescribed by law. The British had done both of these things. The Fourth Amendment protects the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects, against unreasonable searches and seizures. It sets probable cause as the requirement for warrants prior to governmental searches of private property. Colonists really hated the so-called general warrant that let British authorities enter homes to check that all merchandise had appropriate tax stamps. This would stop that. The Fifth Amendment provides for grand jury indictments prior to prosecution, protection against double jeopardy, the right not to incriminate oneself, due process, and compensation when private property is taken for public use. The British had done all these things. The Sixth Amendment gives criminal defendants the right to a speedy and public trial, by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed. The defendant also has the right to cross-examine witnesses against him, the right to compel favorable witnesses to testify, and the assistance of counsel. Back then, some criminal defendants were sent back to England for trial and did not have access to the witnesses. The Seventh Amendment says that in civil suits involving more than $20, the parties have a right to a jury trial and no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise re-examined in any court of the United States than according to the rules of the common law. While federal courts have limited jurisdiction and the $20 limit is antiquated, this amendment assures the right of a jury trial for civil cases and guarantees that jury verdicts won't be overturned, as sometimes happened in England. Those are significant rights to the litigants. The Eighth Amendment says, excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. Many of the punishments back then would certainly be considered cruel today, and bail was often set at unattainable levels. These first 8 amendments expressly apply only to the federal government. The First Amendment, in fact, says, Congress shall make no law, colonies could have such laws, and Congress couldn't change them. Thus, in Massachusetts, until the 1820s, you had to go to the Congregationalist church on Sunday or be fined. Some colonies/new states also prohibited Catholics and Jews from holding public office. In drafting the Bill of Rights, Madison was greatly influenced by George Mason's 1776 Virginia Declaration of Rights, the 1689 English Bill of Rights, and the Magna Carta, 1215. The big difference between the Bill of Rights and the Magna Carta, however, is that the Bill of Rights assumes that power rests with the people and the government only has those powers expressly granted to it. The Magna Carta proceeds from the assumption that the king has the power, but will refrain from using it in certain ways. This assumption about the source of power that underlies the U.S. Bill of Rights is most clearly reflected in the final 2 provisions of the Bill of Rights, the 9th and 10th Amendments to the Constitution. The 9th Amendment provides, the enumeration in the Constitution, of certain rights, shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. That is more or less an express answer to the fears brought up by Alexander Hamilton and others who were concerned that the very existence of a Bill of Rights might be read as suggesting that only the enumerated restrictions applied to the new government. The 10th Amendment says, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. These final 2 provisions of the Bill of Rights, while often overlooked, are profoundly important. Unless otherwise expressly spelled out in the Constitution, governmental powers are reserved to the states and the people. The one-size-fits-all approach of federal lawmaking is incapable of considering the permutations and varieties that best serve individual states. Thus, the federal government is one of limited jurisdiction. That leaves state and local governments, which are closer to the people, in position to be responsive to the people. That is pretty much exactly where revolutionary colonists would have wanted the nation to be. Ronald J. Ricklack is the Jamie P. Whitten Chair in Law and Government at the University of Mississippi. Constitution Day, the Bill of Rights and the Impact of War. Part 3 of 5 on Understanding the Bill of Rights. Ronald J. Ricklack. Contributor. September 18, 2018 updated, September 20, 2018. Print. In honor of U.S. Constitution Day, on September 17, we present a 5-part series on the Bill of Rights. It reveals how the first 10 amendments to the Constitution guarantee freedom of speech, religion, and the press, and, in so many other ways, limit the power of the federal government and secure the rights of individuals. The U.S. Civil War not only shaped the nation, it changed the very structure of the American government. After that war, the country passed 3 enormously important amendments to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment ended slavery in the United States. The 14th Amendment said that states had to provide due process and equal protection of the laws to each citizen. The 15th Amendment granted former slaves the right to vote. Full realization of these rights has taken much longer, but their very expression was a huge development in the laws of the nation. While these Civil War amendments were necessary, they significantly expanded federal authority over the states. Prior to these amendments, limitations on governmental power were found only in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, and they applied only to the federal government. Those rights, of course, hadn't protected all Americans. State laws often discriminated, they allowed slavery to exist. The new 14th Amendment said that all citizens, including former slaves, had the same rights as all other Americans. It prohibited any state from making or enforcing laws that denied an individual's civil rights. The Civil War amendments were good and necessary, but they increased the size of the federal government. The two world wars of the 20th century also led to dramatic growth in the federal government. The First World War and the Roaring Twenties were followed by the Great Depression. President Franklin D. Roosevelt sought to counter that with his New Deal. The programs he proposed went beyond the limited authority of the federal government, and the Supreme Court ruled many of them unconstitutional, including the National Industrial Recovery Act, the Railroad Retirement Act, and the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Rather than accept those rulings, FDR proposed new legislation that would have altered the makeup of the Supreme Court. The Judiciary Reorganization Bill of 1937 provided for broad reform of the federal judicial system, allowing Roosevelt to appoint an additional member to the Supreme Court for every sitting justice over the age of 70, which would have resulted in a total of 6 new justices at the time the bill was introduced. The Constitution doesn't limit the size of the Supreme Court. So, FDR's court-packing plan was a real threat. The bill itself was never enacted, but the court blinked. FDR's New Deal legislation was thereafter usually upheld. Moreover, by remaining in office as long as he did, elected to 4 terms, he eventually appointed 8 justices to the Supreme Court, and they reshaped American law. Soon, virtually any government action in relation to the economy could be taken, so long as it was supported by a political majority. With the new court and a new outlook, FDR set forth a rethinking of American constitutional rights. In the 1941 State of the Union address, he proposed 4 fundamental freedoms that people everywhere in the world ought to enjoy: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Note how the first 2 sound a lot like the Bill of Rights, but the next 2 clearly morph into affirmative rights, not mere restrictions on the government. Norman Rockwell prepared 4 famous paintings depicting these 4 rights, and they were published on the cover of the very popular Saturday Evening Post. The paintings, the magazine, and the president encouraged Americans to change the way they thought about the United States government. They caused citizens to be less afraid of a strong central government and more willing to look upon it as a good thing. The rise of the United States as one of the world's 2 major military powers during and after World War II fueled more growth of the federal government. The expansion of urban and suburban areas in the post-war period made expanded public services more feasible. Greater educational expectations led to significant government investment in schools and colleges. More and more, people turned to the federal government for important programs. In 1944, FDR called for a second Bill of Rights that would assure American workers of a right to a useful and remunerative job in the industries or shops or farms or mines of our nation, and give businessmen the right to be free from unfair competition and domination by monopolies. He announced this new Bill of Rights during his State of the Union message in January 1944. Our economic Bill of Rights, like the sacred Bill of Rights of our Constitution itself, must be applied to all citizens, he said. Along with the earlier mentioned rights, he included the right of every family to a decent home, the right to a good education, and the right to adequate medical care and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health. These new rights, unlike those in the original Bill of Rights, were not natural or God-given rights. Neither nature nor God endows people with a good education, adequate medical care, or a decent home. The government was the source of Roosevelt's rights. If Americans truly had a right to a remunerative job, then government would have to see that it was provided. The same would be true of the right to a decent home. Presumably other Americans would have the responsibility to pay for those homes. To provide these new rights, government would have to tax and redistribute wealth on a massive scale. It would have to grow. Roosevelt's Bill of Rights did not come to pass, but minimum wage and unfair competition laws accomplished much of what he wanted. The so-called GI Bill of Rights of 1944 gave veterans access to low-cost mortgages and cash payments for educational expenses. Those programs significantly reshaped the way Americans came to see higher education and the role of government. They allowed the federal government to grow even larger. The original Bill of Rights promised liberty and freedom from government interference, not governmental growth. Even the necessities of war don't justify governmental growth that interferes with liberty. To those who would sacrifice their rights and their sovereignty due to modern threats such as terrorism or international aggression, William Pitt said, necessity is the plea for every infringement of human freedom. It is the argument of tyrants, it is the creed of slaves. That is why the Bill of Rights exists. Ronald J. Ricklack is the Jamie L. Whitten Chair in Law and Government at the University of Mississippi. Constitution Day, the Bill of Rights and the War in Court. Part 4 of 5 on Understanding the Bill of Rights. Ronald J. Ricklack. Contributor. September 20th, 2018 updated, September 20th, 2018. Print. In honor of U.S. Constitution Day, on September 17, we present a 5-part series on the Bill of Rights. It reveals how the first 10 amendments to the Constitution guarantee freedom of speech, religion, and the press, and, in so many other ways, limit the power of the federal government and secure the rights of individuals. Until the 1960s, the 14th Amendment required states to provide due process and equal protection of the laws to all citizens, but states didn't have to abide by all of the restrictions on governmental action set forth in the Bill of Rights. Those restrictions applied only to the federal government. There was some overlap, but in terms of restrictions on governmental action, states were regulated by the 14th Amendment, which was said to have an independent potency. Criminal defendants in state courts, for instance, were entitled only to that fundamental fairness essential to the very concept of justice. Their rights were very limited, compared to those given to defendants in federal criminal cases. State defendants could be required to testify against themselves. They didn't have the right to an attorney or to a speedy trial as we now understand those terms. They were entitled only to those rights implicit in the concept of ordered liberty. In other words, if we could imagine a just system that didn't provide a particular right, such a jury trial, appointed counsel, or confrontation of opposing witnesses, the state wasn't compelled to provide that right to a criminal defendant. Federal defendants, who fell under the Bill of Rights, were given these protections, but the overwhelming majority of criminal cases took place in state court. They still do. The 60s brought a big change in American criminal laws. The Supreme Court, under Chief Justice Earl Warren, read the 14th Amendment in a new manner. Instead of looking for fundamental rights implicit in the concept of ordered liberty, the court moved to incorporation of provisions contained in the Bill of Rights. By moving to this approach, the Supreme Court led what has been called a revolution in American criminal procedure and provided all of the following rights to state criminal defendants: the freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures and the exclusionary rule, the prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment, the right to assistance of counsel, the privilege against self-incrimination, the right to confront opposing witnesses, the right to remain silent or have an attorney present for questioning, the right to a speedy trial, the right to compel defense witnesses to appear at trial, the right to a jury trial, and protection against double jeopardy. None of those rights were constitutionally required in 1960, but they all were by 1970. In 1972, the death penalty was declared unconstitutional as it was then applied, and, in 1973, states were prohibited from outlawing abortions. The dynamics of this dramatic period for the Supreme Court must be placed into context. State criminal laws had been established by the political process. In other words, the situation as it was before these Supreme Court cases reflected the will of the majority of persons living in any given state. The reforms and the resulting growth of the federal government didn't take place because most people wanted reform. Reforms were enacted only because a majority of the 9 justices wanted reforms. Since most of the issues decided by the Supreme Court were held to be required by the Constitution, state political action couldn't change the law back to where it had been prior to Supreme Court action. As to the death penalty, however, the court's 1972 decision left open the possibility of applying it in a constitutional manner. By 1979, 35 states had acted to reinstate the death penalty, effectively overruling the Supreme Court. They likely would have overturned court decisions on other matters had that been possible. In 1968, Richard Nixon campaigned for president by, in part, running against the activist Supreme Court. He won, but the growth of the federal government didn't slow down. From 1960 to today, the number of federal employees rose from about 2.4 million to about 20 million. While federal spending 100 years ago was about 3% of gross domestic product, it's close to 25% today. The past few years have seen even greater federal expansion into education with Common Core, and into healthcare with Obamacare. With this growth has come many of the concerns that so bothered America's forefathers. Today, we see federal officials infringing more and more upon religion, punishing speech, taking away guns, and violating privacy without warrants by listening in on our conversations. Moreover, there are international institutions such as the International Criminal Court that aren't yet direct threats to Americans, but may one day become threats. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem reported Paul Revere writing at midnight, shouting, "The British are coming." Regardless of whether that really happened, the colonists were facing a threat to their freedom and property from an enemy that was or that had been in charge of the government. Today, the threat is no less real. The continued growth of the federal government and of international institutions is a huge threat to the sovereignty of a free people. Moreover, as governmental power grows, so does the threat of governmental corruption. Daniel Webster said, "God grants liberty only to those who love it, and are always ready to guard and defend it." The Bill of Rights is the promise of the United States to defend liberty. That is why President John F. Kennedy called the Bill of Rights the guardian of our security as well as our liberty. Ronald J. Ricklack is the Jamie L. Whitten Chair in Law and Government at the University of Mississippi. Constitution Day, the Original Bills of Rights. Part 5 of 5 on Understanding the Bill of Rights. Ronald J. Ricklack. Contributor. September 21, 2018 updated, September 21, 2018. Print. In honor of U.S. Constitution Day, on September 17, we present a 5-part series on the Bill of Rights. It reveals how the first 10 amendments to the Constitution guarantee freedom of speech, religion, and the press, and, in so many other ways, limit the power of the federal government and secure the rights of individuals. Congressman James Madison, who co-authored the Federalist Papers along with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, played an important role in drafting the U.S. Constitution at the 1787 Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. He also worked for its subsequent ratification. In 1791, he penned what would become the American Bill of Rights. Madison had been an opponent of inclusion of a Bill of Rights as the Constitution was being written, thinking it unnecessary in terms of the structure of the new government. He came to realize, however, that such a list was politically necessary in order to guarantee ratification of the Constitution and the stability of the young nation. As he worked on the draft, he had to win public support while preserving the structural integrity of the Constitution. He reviewed more than 200 proposed amendments including such things as a proposal from Pennsylvania that farmers should always be guaranteed a bounty for squirrel pelts and distilled them to 20 amendments with a separate preamble. Madison actually wanted to amend the language of the Constitution to insert these rights, but during floor debates, it was decided to add them as an appendix rather than rewrite everything. Only because it was an appendix did it become known as a separate document. If Madison had his way, Americans probably never would have thought of it that way. As it was, people didn't refer to it as the Bill of Rights for many years. George Washington commissioned 14 handwritten copies of that document, one for each of the original 13 colonies and one for Congress. On October 2, 1789, he sent a copy to each of the states and kept one in the Capitol. 12 of Washington's original documents survive to this day. 2 were lost in fires. North Carolina's copy has the most interesting story. North Carolina wasn't prepared to ratify the Constitution until a Bill of Rights was added. Immediately following its ratification and its entry into the United States on December 22, 1798, one of Washington's copies was sent to North Carolina's capital in Raleigh. The front of the parchment was signed by John Adams and Speaker of the House Frederick Muhlenberg. A North Carolina clerk signed the back of it for record-keeping purposes before he put it into a filing box labeled 1789 Proposed Amendments to the Constitution of the U.S., where it seems to have stayed until the U.S. Civil War. On or about April 13, 1865, General Sherman's Union troops marched through North Carolina and into Raleigh. At the Capitol, soldiers raided display cases and took what they wanted, leaving papers and broken glass strewn between the Senate and the House of Commons. A Union infantryman took the document as a souvenir and brought it to his home in Tippecanoe, Ohio. On the day after the war ended, the unnamed soldier sold it for $5 to Charles Shotwell, a grain salesman in Troy, Ohio. In 1897, state officials discovered that Shotwell had possession of the document. He refused to return it, and nothing more was heard until 1925. For almost 60 years, Shotwell kept the document at his home. When he finally agreed to part with it, a colleague named Charles I Reed contacted the North Carolina Historical Commission to offer it for sale. A letter dated March 25, 1925, said that the possessor wished any reasonable honorarium. North Carolina officials, however, said the document was stolen property and had to be returned without payment, so they refused to make an offer. The copy resurfaced in 1995, when a Washington attorney, representing several unidentified individuals, contacted the North Carolina Department of Cultural Resources wanting to sell it. The individuals claimed the document was worth $3 million to $10 million. State officials, however, still considered it stolen property and said they wouldn't use tax dollars to pay for it. Then, in 2003, Wayne Pratt, an antique collector who was a regular on PBS's Antiques Roadshow, told potential buyers that he had found one of Washington's original Bill of Rights in an upstate New York antique store. He claimed it couldn't be traced back to any state, thus it was perhaps not stolen. In reality, Pratt had purchased it from two Connecticut women for $200,000. He tried to sell the document to the National Constitution Center, a museum in Philadelphia. The National Constitution Center sent it to Washington historians, who found a faint bit of handwriting on the backside of the document. It turns out the writing belonged to the same North Carolina state clerk who, in 1789, had first signed it before depositing the document in the archives. Thus, this was the missing North Carolina copy of the Bill of Rights. Next, came an arrest and seizure that could have been ripped from a movie script. It involved an FBI undercover agent posing as a philanthropist, a $4 million check, and half a dozen agents bursting into the room where a delivery man carrying the document had just arrived. Subsequent court proceedings determined that North Carolina was the innocent owner of stolen property and was entitled to recover the document. Pratt relinquished his claim in exchange for the promise that he wouldn't be prosecuted for any potential crime associated with the attempted sale. So, North Carolina's copy of the Bill of Rights is back home. Due to its age and susceptibility to damage from light, North Carolina only exhibits it on special occasions. The protections that it provides, however, are among the most precious rights of American citizenship. They remain in place, even if not on display, at all times. Ronald J. Ricklack is the Jamie L. Whitten Chair in Law and Government at the University of Mississippi.